Welcome back, and let's remind ourselves what we did in the previous part. So we created this parallax scrolling website thing that you can see in front of you. We've got all kinds of cool things going on there. But the code was really hacky. And in this part, we're going to fix all of that because we're going to create a library that allows us to get all of the functionality that we need in a very clean and easy to consume interface. And that makes us as developers very happy. So before we take a look at the solution, let's first remind ourselves of just how bad the code was and the problems that we're trying to fix. So as far as I'm concerned, there was two major problems with the code that we have here. So the base structure of the code is we have sections, and each section represents a part of the website. So we have this section here in this block of the if statement that is the scaling of the mountains. And then we have the transition, and then we have the words splitting apart, and each of these sections are in a separate part of the if statement. So the first issue is that within each of these sections, we typically have to be calculating the relative offset that the scroll is within that section. So we calculate it here, and then we recalculate it here, and then we calculate an offset here, and we're constantly doing that. And that's repetitive work, and we don't like that. So we'll need to fix that issue. And the second issue, which is a much bigger issue in my opinion, is the separation of concerns, or lack thereof, that we have in this code. In each section, we have to have some code that resets the section before we reach it. Then we need the code that animates while we're inside the section, and then the code that resets after the section. So for example, we have this transition. And inside the transition, the animation code is these two lines where we're just animating the opacity. But then in the previous section, we have this line where we're actually resetting the opacity to 1, and then in the next section, we're resetting the opacity to 0. So we have code that is for the transition section, inside the mountain scaling section, and also inside the word splitting section. So we just have an amalgam of concerns that are just all intermingled, and it's awful. So we want to split all of that out and separate everything nicely. So with those two issues in mind, let's think about what would be a nice interface to use to try and generate this. So to do that, I'm just going to open up Vim, and I'm just going to create a throwaway.js. So let's just create some throwaway code here that illustrates the way that I would like this code to be structured. So my idea here is that I would like a function that acts as a controller for each section. Each section would have one, and then we would just register that with the library and tell the library just call this function with the required information. So we would define the controller like this, and it would be like section ctrl, and then into this is what the library will provide to us. And I think the first argument would be an offset, and that would be the offset relative to the current section. So that offset would be negative if we're before the section. At the exact point we hit the section, that offset would be 0, and then we keep scrolling and that offset would grow. And then the second argument would be the duration of this section, and we would define that in some kind of configuration. And now with that, we can do all of the code that had all the mixed concerns very easily. So we can say if offset is less than 0, we know we're before the section because the offset passed in is relative to the section. So here we could do any reset before section. So we could have all of that reset code in there. And then we could have else if offset is less than duration. And at this point, we know that the offset's greater than 0, so we know we're inside the section because this if statement failed. And then we're checking if we're still within the section, which is less than the duration. And then here we would have the animation code. And then else if, or it wouldn't even be an else if, it would just be an else. So we're past the duration, so we could reset after section. And now we've got 3 nice if statements that are just blocking it out, and all of the code for this section is contained within this controller, and then every section would have a controller. So we fixed issue number 1 because the library is passing us the relative offset, so we don't have to calculate that. And then we're fixing issue 2, the separation of concerns, by having separate controllers for every section, so we don't need to mix and match. So then with that controller, we now need a way of defining the configuration for each section. So I'm thinking we would instantiate a new Parallax provider. So this is the library we're writing. We're calling it Parallax provider. And then into this instantiation, we would pass an array. And then this array will be an array of objects where each object defines a section within our app. So we would give it, each section would have a mount point. So this is the point at which the section actually starts. So the first one would be mounted at 0. We would give it a duration, we'd say that's 500 pixels, and we would give it a controller, and we'd say that's section CTRL, for example. And then we could define another one, and mount point, and we want this to start at the exact end of the previous one. So we'd give that a mount point of 500, because this is mounted at 0, its duration is 500, so this is mounted at 500, which is the end of this. And we give this a duration of say 300, controller, you get the point. So then we can have as many of these sections, each of which has a controller, and then the controllers are just called with the relative offset and duration, and we can do any sort of interactions inside these controllers as we need. So with that, let's actually start writing some code. So I'll just delete this throwaway. So in the folder right now, I just have 2 files. I have an editor config and a git ignore. So this is my editor config. So I'm not going to explain what editor config is. It's just a way for people who are using different editors to display the code correctly and format the code correctly. And then our git ignore, we're just ignoring some things there. So before we write any actual code, we're just going to need to set up the project. And I'm going to set this project up with the ultimate goal of deploying to NPM in mind. So we'll set it up with some build tools and the things that we're going to need to future-proof this project. So let's just close out Vim. So for this project, I'm going to use a bundling tool called Rollup and a transpilation tool called Babel. So Babel allows us to write modern JavaScript syntax, and then that will then convert it into the older style syntax that will run in the various platforms that we want it to, be that in the browser or wherever. And then Rollup allows us to bundle multiple files together into a single file and expose an interface like an ECMAScript module or like the UMD modules, which can be used in the browser or CommonJS or any of these different modulating specs. Rollup allows us to target any of them or multiple of them and spit those out. So again, I'm going to do more videos on what these different tools are, but for now, you can go off and do your own research if you need to, but we're just going to add them into our project. So we'll start off, we'll just say yarn init y, just to get a package JSON. And I'm just going to copy in the installation line. So we're adding dev dependencies of Babel core, Babel CLI, Babel preset env, rollup, and rollup plugin Babel. So we'll just let that install. And I'll see you in a second when this is all done. So we're all installed. So now we're going to add a few configuration files. So we'll open up Vim so we can add those in. The first one is a Babel RC. So this just tells Babel how we want to use it. And this is quite a simple one. Just paste this in. We're just using the Babel preset env preset. So we'll save that and we'll create a rollup.config.js. And I will copy in the configuration we need for that. And that's it. So we're just importing the Babel plugin, and then we're giving the library a name. We're telling it that the source index.js is our input file, and then from there we'll just traverse the dependency tree and pull in all the other files that we're importing. And then we're outputting a UMD, a CommonJS, and an ECMAScript module. And we're using the Babel plugin, so we're getting transpilation with Babel. So now the last thing I'll do is just add some NPM scripts. So we'll just add a script property here in our package JSON, and I'll give it a build script, which we'll call rollup-c, and I'll give it a dev script, which we'll call rollup-c-w. So now we'll just create our source directory and our index.js file, and we'll open that up. So now in our index.js, we can start writing our Parallax provider class. So we will just export default class Parallax provider constructor, and then into our constructor, we're going to pass that array of sections. So we'll call those modules. So we're passing in this array of modules, and then we want to check if modules and modules.length, then this.modules equals modules. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is set up the scroll listener, because of course we need to listen for scroll events just like we did in the previous part. So we'll create a listen to scroll method, and here we'll say document.add event listener scroll, and then we'll just give it a callback, and eventually we'll put some code in there, and we'll call that immediately here. So now that's setting us up with a basic structure. We've got our modules defined inside our class, and we're calling the scroll listener. And just like we did in the previous part, we want to grab hold of the Y offset inside here. So that would be window.page Y offset. So that is the total absolute global scroll position that we're currently at within our app. At its very core, what we want to do is every time there's a scroll event called, we want to loop through all of our modules and then call each of the module controllers and pass in the relative offset and the duration of that module. So we'll say this.modules.forEach, and for each module, we'll grab hold of the duration, which is module.duration, and then we'll call module.controller, and we'll give it a first argument, which we'll talk about, and then duration as the second argument. So here, as the first argument, we want to pass in the relative offset for this particular module. So that's going to be y off, which is the global offset, minus the module.mount point. So if you remember, each module has a mount point, which we defined as the point in the space of the app that we want that module to start. So if the mount point is 500 pixels and we've scrolled down 600 pixels, we're 100 pixels into that section, right? So we want that offset passed into the controller to be 100. So in this case, y off would be 600, but the module.mount point is 500. So 600 minus 500 is the 100 offset that we're looking for. So y off minus module.mount point gives us that relative offset, and we're passing it in. So already we could say we have a finished library. I mean, we don't. We've solved a lot of our problems already. We've got the separation of concerns already fixed, because we can now have each section have its own controller. We've also got the calculation of our offset relative to the section figured out, because we've got it here, already figured out for us. So we've actually solved the initial problems that we had. But of course, that's not where we finish, because there's always other things we can improve. So one thing that I'm thinking here is this module.mount point is an absolute value. So in the throwaway code we wrote, the first section was mounted at 0, and that was fine. And then the second section, we wanted that to start immediately after the first section. So we had to calculate in our head the point at which we needed that to mount so that it started exactly after the first section. So we had to say the first section mount point, and then add on the duration, and then make that the new mount point for the second section. I mean, that's still some cognitive overhead that we need to deal with to mount that correctly. And if you start having 10 or 15 sections, that maths might get tricky to keep track of in your head. So I'm thinking that most use cases are going to want to mount each section exactly after the last one. So if we make this mount point relative to the end of the previous section, that would make everything much cleaner, because then we could have section 1 mount point 0 and duration 500, and that would mount that right at the start of the page. And then the second section, which we want to start immediately afterwards, we would set that mount point to 0 as well, and then it would mount it exactly afterwards. And if we happen to want to start it 200 pixels before the end of the previous section, we would mount it at -200, etc., etc. And that is much cleaner, much easier to deal with. So let's now implement that relative mounting system. So we'll do that by creating an init function where we can do some calculations, because we're going to need to figure out what the absolute mount point of each section is, because right here we're doing y-off minus mount points, but this mount point assumes an absolute value. So in the initialization, we're going to need to convert all of the relative mountings that the user is thinking about and the user is using in their configuration, and convert all of that into absolute values that we can then use to calculate the correct offsets. So we've got this init, and we'll call this .init up here. And just for convenience, instead of calling this listen to scroll here, we'll call that at the end of the initialization. Here inside the initialization, we're going to loop through all of the modules. And every loop through, we're going to remember what the previous module was and figure out the point at which the previous module ended, and then use that as the mount point for the next section. So this is kind of tricky to explain. I'm just going to type the code out and then we'll talk about what it does. So initially, I'll just define new modules array. So this is just going to be empty, and this is just so that we can populate that with some new data without mutating our original this.modules array. And here we'll say for let I equals 0, I is less than this.modules.length, I plus plus const module equals this.modules I, and then we'll say the number of new modules equals new modules.length. So right now, obviously, new modules.length is always 0 because there's nothing in it. But we're going to add stuff to it through every loop. So this won't always be 0, and it'll make a bit more sense in a bit. Then with that number of new modules, we can say previous module equals, and then we'll do a ternary expression here. We'll say num new modules. So if that isn't 0, that actually has a value. So there is some modules in this new modules array. Then previous module will equal new modules dot length minus 1. And if num new modules is 0, so there is no new modules in this array, then it just equals null. And then we'll say that end of previous module equals 0. So this is just the default value for the end of the previous module. So when we're very first starting the app, there is no previous module. So the mount point is going to mount from 0. So we're setting this end previous module to 0. And then as we start adding new modules, we'll update that value to represent the end of the previous module, which is the mount point of the next one. And then we'll check if there is a previous module. So of course, on the first loop through, there won't be a previous module, because previous module checks if there's anything in this new modules array. So the first loop through, there's nothing in this array, so previous modules will equal null, and then this if statement will fail. And we'll come back and we'll write some code in here that will be triggered when there is new modules in that new modules array, and those will be added on the subsequent loops. So for now, we'll just continue down here and we'll create a new variable. We'll call it absolute mount point, and that will be equal to the end of the previous module, which of course on the first loop is still just 0, but that's what we want because we want to mount from the top of the page, and it will be plus module, just coming from here, dot mount point. And then onto the module, we'll set underscore absolute mount point equals absolute mount point. So So we're putting an underscore here just to denote as a convention that this is an internal private property that shouldn't be accessed from outside, but that's just a convention. So just a quick rundown of what we've done here. So we're taking the end of the previous module, which is 0. So let's just assume there's only one module to loop through. So this loop basically doesn't exist. We're just running through the code once. We're getting hold of that module. We're checking if there's any previous modules. There isn't. This is going to have nothing in it, so the length of it's going to be 0. So previous module equals null. End previous module equals 0. And then end previous module plus the mount point of the current module is the absolute mount point. So because this is the first module, we want it to mount from the top of the page. And if we set that first module to have a mount point of 0, it would be the end of the previous module, which is 0, plus the mount point, which is also 0. So that will mount at the top of the page. But if we want it to mount 100 pixels down from the top of the page, then we would set the mount point to be 100. And then we would have 0 plus 100. So the absolute mount point would be 100. And now at the end of here, we'll take new modules and we'll push on this new module that we've just taken and added this absolute mount point. I've just noticed a typo there. So this module is exactly the same as what was in this.modules, except we've added this new absolute mount point. We've calculated that here, we've pushed it on. So now let's go into the second iteration of this for loop. So we're taking the second module, number of new modules equals new modules.length. That equals 1 now because we pushed this down here. Now previous module, this exists, so previous module will now equal that one that we pushed down here. Previous endpoint equals 0. Again, we're just resetting that, but we're not going to have it as 0. We're going to recalculate it inside here. So if previous module, that now exists, so we can have some code. So we don't want the end of the previous module to be 0 anymore, because we already have a module, so the end of that should be calculated. So we'll remove that, and we'll say previous duration equals previous module dot duration. And now, with that duration, we can calculate the end of that previous section. So end of previous module equals previous module dot underscore absolute mount point plus previous duration. So let's think about this. So we're on the second loop through, and the first module was mounted at 0 and had a duration of 500 pixels. So now we're grabbing hold of the second module, we're grabbing hold of that previous module, and then we're getting into this if statement. So this duration is the previous module dot duration, so that's 500. And previous module dot absolute mount point was calculated here on the previous iteration to be 0. So that's 0 plus 500. So then this end previous module is now 500, which is what we would expect. And then we move to here. Absolute mount point is that 500 plus the mount point of the second module. So if we mounted that at 0, it'll now be mounted at 500, which is the absolute mount point. This is kind of tricky to wrap your mind around, but I'm hoping that my explanation has done it justice, that you can understand that through each of these loops, we're calculating the absolute value of each module's mount point. And then we can use that in our scroll listener. But before we do that, there's one thing we need to do, which is after this for loop, we need to reassign this .modules to new modules. Otherwise, we won't have access to this absolute mount point. So once we've calculated this, we can reassign it. So we don't want to be reassigning things in here in case we mutate things and things can get weird. So we're just populating a new modules array, and then once we're done, reassigning this .modules. So now down here in our scroll event listener, instead of looking for module.mountPoint, we can use absolute mount point. So now this code is doing exactly the same thing, but it allows the user and the consumer of this library to think about everything in relative terms, and then we're doing the heavy lifting to calculate the absolutes. So with that, I think this is a pretty good start to the library. There are plenty of other features that we could add. maybe we can have a mount type property in the configuration that allows the user to specify if they want to mount relative or absolute. That'd be pretty cool. And maybe we can give each section an ID and then have a mount after ID property in the configuration. So we could have different properties and we can mount it relative to a different ID instead of always being tethered to the one that was declared previously. And there's a ton of other things that we could do. Maybe we could have some way of adding an attribute into HTML so that this library pulls in all of those elements so that we have access to them. The possibilities truly are endless here, and I kind of want to set you off and like let you run with it. If you want to submit pull requests to this library, you do that. By all means, I would love that. There is links in the description to the GitHub. You have an understanding of how the code works, so it's not that intimidating. So have a go. Submit some pull requests, open some issues, let's have a discussion and make this thing pretty cool. So with that, I'll end this video. So if you liked it, thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, bell notification, support me on Patreon if you enjoy what I do. But until next time, stay hungry and keep coding.